Following the dictum of Andy Warhol, he said, always leave me wanting less. And this is a bit more critical, I guess you'd say. It's a kind of review, I guess, of Ben Quilty's big exhibition of paintings that he'd done in Afghanistan, which are now on show at the Australian Memorial, I'm sure for the huge Gallipoli celebration that will be coming up in a week. The fog of war, the resonant term that seeks to capture, quote, the uncertainty regarding one's own capacity, adversary intent during an engagement, operation or campaign. The fog of war, its meaning expanded in Errol Morris's award-winning 2003 documentary of the same name on US Secretary of Defence Robert S. McNamara, the so-called architect of the Vietnam War, to cover both the difficulty objectively of justifying and reciprocally even criticising such a gargantuan and simultaneously over and underdetermined act as going to war, and subjectively of thinking through in a clear and reflective way one's own relationship to this act. McNamara in the film was famously unwilling or unable to reconsider his original motives in leading the US to war in Vietnam. The fog of war, a long-running trope or even platitude about war, all the way from Clausewitz's On War of 1832, in which the term was originally coined, through to such contemporary board games as Kriegspiel and video games as Warcraft, in which it is a limitation both sides have to take into account, and the unresolved and perhaps ultimately unresolvable debates that take place over Australia's entry into conflicts today, from the intervention in East Timor to the first invasion of Iraq to the more recent engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq again. Now, it's undoubtedly intriguing that in the light of the recent popularity of this term, the fog of war, which is like about the unknowability of many aspects of the war, which is spoken of almost as an actual doctrine in the film of that name, that the decision was recently made by the Australian government to reinstate war artists as an official part of Australia's military campaigns after an almost 30-year break following the Vietnam War. Amongst the first of the official war artists was Wendy Sharp in East Timor in 1999, then George Gittos in Iraq in 2003, Sean Gladwell in Afghanistan in 2009, and perhaps most notably, or at least most visibly in terms of public attention, Ben Quilty once more in Afghanistan in 2011. This is intriguing because in a time of a fog of war, artists are meant to provide an image of the war and everything the image stands for, to represent the war, to make sense of it, to reveal something otherwise unknown about it. Now clearly there's a long history of paintings of war, but the genre they are most associated with in the West is history painting, whose aim is to render contemporary events legible through the use of historical precedent and compositional clarity, often lateral, thus implying a kind of continuity, narratability, historicity. We can see this, for example, in Jacques-Louis David's The Army Takes an Oath of 1810, which depicts the 1805 ceremony of the army swearing allegiance to Napoleon after his assumption of power. Or again, Francois Girard's The Battle of Austerlitz, also of 1810, which depicts Napoleon's famous victory over Russian and Austrian forces the same year he took power. In both cases, celebratory or otherwise sometimes traumatic or catastrophic incidents in these history paintings are presented as though already mediated by history, already meaningful, exactly insofar as they are represented by and shown to be able to be represented by art. Now, we are undoubtedly able, even within the much shorter span of Australian war painting, to trace the progressive decline and even impossibility of such a conception of war painting and the history painting of which war painting is an instance. We begin with the pre-modern and the first war artists like Will Dyson, John Longstaff, Arthur Streeton and George Lambert. In their work, we are given an overall view of war: panoptic, syncretic, objective, heroic, even if fictitious, like Lambert's Anzac Landing. We are given a general's view of war, a distanced overall perspective, that of the corps or battalion fighting it and not the men. By the time of the Second World War, such artists as Ivor Heel, Arthur Murch, Ernest Buckmeister and Frank Hodgson, a kind of modernist doubt had crept in. Artists refused to generalise and concentrated instead on the individual experience of the soldier, in pain, suffering, united only as human beings and not as members of a unit. But all of this is depicted coolly and dispassionately, in as much detail as possible, as though serving as evidence from the outside. Or in the work of such artists as Colin Colahan and his grey and brown and not black and white images of war traitors on trial, we again have a kind of neutrality or refusal to judge. The work is not overtly partisan or seeking to take sides either for or against the accused, because undoubtedly Colahan was painting too close to the sense that if the other side had won the war, all this would have been different. Now, in both sets of images, a truth is accorded to subjective experience, but there is no attempt directly to identify with it. We look on at the suffering of soldiers from the outside, just as there is no attempt to know how traitors feel or why they acted as they did. There is something incommensurable about the images that is also a way of respecting the otherness of others. Now, although the Australian War Artist Program was not officially wound down until after the Vietnam War, an unpopular war fought by unpopular soldiers, we might say that we see the seeds of its decline already in World War II. Already, for all of their studied neutrality and detail of depiction, there is still the question of what individual experience validated as subjective can tell us about the war. Indeed, with Alan Moore's image of the newly liberated concentration camps, the very question is posed as to whether the truth can be imaged or represented at all. And then with the Vietnam War, even the respect of the authenticity of the soldiers' experience is devalued. Now the truth of individual suffering is no longer to be able to be taken for granted, depicted in an unmarked way. We see this in Bruce Fletcher's Long Tan Action, 1966, which I think seems strident, overtly ideological, unconvincing in its need to exaggerate, or conversely, in Barrie Ward's Vietnam, in which the soldiers fighting cannot be seen, seem almost to disappear before our eyes. And there's a very striking tendency in the Vietnam photos of soldiers fighting in very long grass, as though you wouldn't want to depict even the soldiers anymore. They don't stand for anything that you want to show, which is kind of, I think, remarkable, like the guy on the stretcher. And that's Australia's definitive image of the Vietnam War, in fact, and we probably don't know it that well. An image of war seemed unable to be produced, whether objective or subjective. And this remained the case until 1999 with the taking of artists to East Timor. And the question is, how was this possible? Certainly it corresponded to a change in government with the Howard Coalition elected in 1997. But it corresponded also to a change in artistic ideology from modernism to postmodernism. And indeed this might tell us something important about postmodernism insofar as it seems possible that under it we were once again able to make war images. But what is it particularly that our current generation of war artists have to tell us about the possibility of making war art? What is it that is not the pre-modern or modern, but the postmodern attitude towards making war art? What approach regarding war do they manage to express beyond the objectivity of the pre-modern and the subjectivity of the modern? And we attempt to answer these questions here by looking closely at the work of the artist Ben Quilty, who was stationed with Australian forces in Kabul, Kandahar and Tarin Kot throughout the month of October 2011, and briefly comparing his work to that of Sean Gladwell and Lyndall Brown and Charles Green. Now, of the three sets of artists, it's undoubtedly Quilty who has received the greatest public attention, both for his overall artistic project and persona, and his war paintings. Now, his war paintings have been highly and virtually unanimously praised, as we'll see, and a work like Sergeant P, after Afghanistan 2012, has been the subject of a successful appeal to acquire it by the Queensland Art Gallery, in which, amazingly for a work of contemporary art, the public was asked to raise the money, which attests to the wide public support that Quilty's work receives from the public and that the gallery felt that it would get from the public. Now, Quilty is, in fact, relatively rare amongst his generation of artists for making what we might call Australian art. Sean Gladwell is also notable in this regard. At a time when most young artists here seek to make art that could come from anywhere, thereby avoiding the accusation of nationalism, Quilty is notable for the distinctively Australian iconography and experience that he attempts to convey. His heavily impasted and loosely stroked oils depict Holden Tiranas, budgerigars and the landscape of Gill, and such widely loved Australian icons as Captain Cook, Jimmy Barnes and Margaret Olley. And his artistic biography strongly features the fact that he grew up in Kenthurst on the northwest fringes of Sydney, spending a bogan adolescent, quote, getting drunk and getting in trouble with his mates. In other words, he puts forward what he would claim is a distinctively Australian young male experience, or this experience is understood as distinctively Australian. It's this Australianness in that classic self-deprecating anti-authoritarian form that could be said to go all the way back to the Goldfields etchings of S.T. Gill of the 1850s and the bush poetry of Lawson and Patterson later in the century, that, we might suggest, led to Quilty being selected as a war artist. The Australian War Memorial Commissioners, in at once an innovative and conservative gesture, must have hoped that he would bring the same laconic, populist, anti-elitist attitude to the depiction of the lives of young male soldiers as was to be seen in his other work. It is exactly Quilty's success in translating his earlier concerns to the battlefield that commentators have remarked upon. Like the modernist artists, Quilty is undoubtedly concerned with the subjective experience of the soldier, but even more than the modernists, it is the experience of the single soldier outside of their unit or battalion. While in Afghanistan, Quilty made a series of sketches in the field, some of which are exhibited as drawings, but the works that are most commented upon and that he claims are at the heart of his experience are a series of studio portraits, all subtitled After Afghanistan, when he invited returned or furloughed soldiers back after their tours to his studio so that he could paint them. Now, examples of these are Air Commodore John Odie, number 2, Captain Kate Porter and Trooper Daniel Westcott, all 2012. These portraits were all exhibited in a long-running touring show that visited many centres in Australia and has climaxed in Canberra, December 2014, along with such other paintings as Tarancot 2012, Tarancot Hilux 2012, and Transparent Night After Afghanistan 2011. That's the remake of a street, of course. And drawings such as Tarancot Firing Range and Waiting Tarancot. But it's undoubtedly the portraits that have been the principal subject of critical attention and praise. Early on, when they were exhibited at the Cairns Regional Art Gallery in 2013, and I don't want to say this too much, but we have a very nice example, I think, of sort of like a nationalist groupthink on behalf of these portraits when we read the critics. Jeanette Hutchinson wrote in the periodical Art Gaze, quote, "It is an overwhelming sense of loss and the unspeakable that Quilty has depicted so honestly in thickly applied paint that confronts the viewer." It's an attitude echoed by the famously hard-to-please critic for the Sydney Morning Herald, John MacDonald, who, when the works were exhibited in Canberra, wrote, quote, "The works have a cumulative power. One sees these pictures as portraits of damaged, exhausted individuals who still carry around the stress and sickness of their time in Afghanistan." And it's precisely this empathetic connection with his sitters that Quilty himself emphasises in his explanation of the work. It's not any pro or anti-war attitude that he wishes to express, but a more general sympathy and gratitude for the soldiers' sacrifices and risks undertaken on behalf of all of us. As he says in one of the 2 ABC Australian story episodes devoted to his time in Afghanistan, quote, "Because I've been there, they're quite open to letting me know about how they feel. And this is what I wanted to know as an artist. It's not just about my experience of Afghanistan, but the experience through the eyes of these people." So he's trying to present the specificity of their experience. That's the claim. It's also what Quilty makes clear in the artist statement at the front of the catalogue of the Australian War Memorial exhibition, where he says, "As an official Australian war artist, my job wasn't to ask questions about Australia's involvement in a war far from our shores, and it wasn't to climb on a fence and to shout my views about the age-old act of combat. My job was to tell the story of the Australian men and women who are at war in Afghanistan. And we have to think how this is an instinctive response to those previous attitudes to war painting and their historical failure. It's neither the objective triumphalism that necessarily involves all of us of the pre-moderns, nor the retreat into an individual subjective experience that cannot be shared and can only be looked on from the outside as in modernism. Rather, what is being dramatised, what is the real subject of Quilty's works, is first the painter's and then the viewer's ability to enter into an empathetic relationship with these soldiers. But the success of these works tell us that they also accord with the wider ideology of our times. With Quilty's portraits, we do not have to respect the otherness of the soldier's experience as with modernism, but we also do not actually have to bother with knowing the details of what the soldiers went through as with the pre-moderns. We just abstractly have to feel or sympathise with them, and that is enough. And this is the exact correlate of that very condition Quilty says he's otherwise fighting against, that our rehabilitation services for returned soldiers are not enough for them in fact, but merely enough for us to believe that we're doing enough for them. In other words, we suggest that there is an unconscious or unacknowledged tension in the commentators and Quilty's responses to the paintings. On the one hand, they claim that they offer a real insight into the soldiers' lives, as though through Quilty's work we might actually get to know them, their inner lives and struggles, as though by doing this it might somehow explain the war, give it a justification it does not otherwise seem to have. But we suggest that there is something of a projection or wish fulfillment, or even a response to an unconscious sense of guilt about this, and that the real experience of the work is in fact an empty expressiveness, the signs of expressivity without anything actually being expressed. And that not only do we not come to know what the soldiers went through, but that what the paintings ultimately offer the viewer, and I think hence their public success, is precisely a way of avoiding any real confrontation with the consequences of the war, the public performance of responsibility without any of its real-world consequences. And we find this necessary vagueness and doubleness spoken of, or indicated almost symptomatically in the better and more responsive criticism on the work. For example, Michael Desmond, Deputy Director of the Australian War Memorial, writes in a review of an Adelaide Biennale in which the work was shown, quote, "Paint, inevitably in Quilty's work, is his prime vehicle for conveying feeling. Dribbles strike a lugubrious note in many of these works, particularly the portrait of Air Commodore John Odey. Blood, tears, paint. His visceral technique supports the emotional response of the subjects to their wartime experience and to a sympathetic interpretation of their state of mind by the viewer." And we suggest that the same irresolution and second thoughts are to be found in the very details of the work itself, which must be understood not merely as a failure of technique, but as a paradoxical self-limitation or withdrawal of technique, or at least as the meaning of Quilty's evident failure, I think, of a painting technique. In fact, these portraits, as portraits were classically meant to do, fail to convey any insight into their sitters' inner lives. But there's a tension in the work between Quilty's belief in a pure expressivity, indicated by a collapse of all spatial boundaries, all recognisable distinctions, the throw of the paint, and a fear that the paintings would not communicate at all without some use of familiar and socially shared landmarks. One works against the other, but both together miss the specificity of an encounter. We have either an empty expressivity that requires nothing, or a resort to a generic and by now stereotyped signs which together produce the appropriate empathetic distance from the subject. Consider, for example, the similarity of the contorted or distorted poses of many of his subjects. Troy Park, Trooper M, and Lance Corporal M, for all of their claimed differences of their experience. In other words, these are responses to apparently specific incidents that these individual soldiers suffered in the war. Like one of them apparently lay behind a sort of broken wall being sniped at for 18 hours. The attempt to convey the specificity of their action is cut against by the genericness of their distorted poses. If you go back again, they're all literally in the same position, more or less. Or consider Quilty's trademark mixing or even non-mixing of colours on his brush and not the palette. Now the danger of this, of course, is a mere muddiness or loss of form. But against this, Quilty repeatedly uses a last-minute black or chiaroscuro to reintroduce some distinction. As in the neck of Troy Park, the arms of Captain Kate Porter go up. Well, there's a great example. That's fantastic. See that arm down, the hand down the bottom is a completely sloppy mess until he's got that V of black paint. Go to Kate Porter. Again, you can see the use of the black to delineate that right arm, for instance. It's the very last thing. Otherwise, it's nothing. Or, in a very traditional way, Quilty produces, and this is, I think, very telling, more detailed renderings of older and more high-ranked officers, like Air Commodore John Odie, Captain S. They're much higher-ranked officers, and they're depicted much more, quote, realistically, as though they deserve more attention, rather than the younger and more junior soldiers, Trooper Luke Corman, whose face is barely there, and Trooper Daniel Spain, which is a cliche that they're less marked by the war. Why? Less marked by life. That's a cliche, a rather obvious cliche. And Quilty frequently averts signs of this empathetic connection between him and his subject with waves of coloured paint passing out of the head of his sitter, or a kind of all-black objective correlative that at once matches and surrounds the sitter in the diptych Trooper Daniel Spain. But in another way, and this in that sense of self-retraction, self-contradiction, or even self-erasure we see in the work, that black right-hand side of Daniel Spain can be understood as a crossing or cancelling out of the left-hand side. Precisely for all of Quilty's talk of specificity, there's a refusal or an inability to distinguish too far, to depict too much, to bring home to us the reality of war. What he's trying to express, or what he's subject to, is an ideology of a general undirected sympathy with the other, and thus the sense that all the works are somehow doubled by an invisible limit they cannot or do not wish to cross. They would not be successful portraits in our society for all of their attempting to identify with the other if they came too close or showed too much. Paradoxically, we don't really want to know about war. We want to remain in this fog. Not simply a lack of technique to detail the soldiers in sufficient specificity, but a deliberate cancelling out or turning back. The black in the portraits not only of Daniel Spain and Luke Corman, but also the shadow behind Kate Porter, or in what we take to be the explosion of Kandahar. That is not the detail of someone being blown up. It's an expression of an explosion, but not anything. Now, Quilty is not the kind of postmodern artist who explicitly reflects on the situation of painting, although his entire oeuvre, with this litany of outmoded and excessive objects, souped up cars, skulls, hamburgers with a lot, is also a ceaseless allegory of the sort of excessiveness of figurative painting today. But this self-cancelling gesture we find throughout his work was perhaps found in the great German painter Gerhard Richter's first so-called foundational painting, Table, which precisely crosses itself out. Now, although Quilty does not have Richter's virtuosity of technique that he would then, of course, consciously refuse, I think. Now, Richter's Table is paradoxically the work that made figurative painting artistically possible again. Figurative painting as a form of unpainting. Figurative painting as the making of an image being necessarily also the unmaking of an image. And Richter himself has paid homage throughout his career to perhaps the first great modernist or even postmodern painter who dealt with the same end or impossibility of painting, Edouard Manet. We might think of Richter's series on the Baader-Meinhof gang and Manet's Dead Toreador. Now, art historian T.J. Clarke's great book on Manet, The Painting of Modern Life, first appeared in 1985, at once the highest expression of the ideological analysis of art and coming towards the very end of this moment, perhaps even hastening it. There were not many similar attempts after Clarke, and soon after, postmodernism would sweep away its Marxist-based superstructure conception of culture, and thus in many ways the very practice of reading images to ask what they mean, how they function ideologically in the society in which they appear. Now, Clarke's argument is that mid-19th century Paris, with the rise of new models of consumerism, the opening up of public space, the crisis of legitimacy of the Second Empire, constituted a definitive experience of modernity. And it was Manet's art, precisely his artistic modernism, that was its definitive expression. Indeed, in that classic Marxist manner, Clarke does suggest that the times produced the artist. However, the novel and not commonly commented upon aspect of Clarke's argument is that Manet does not so much give direct expression to, or is not the direct expression of, this experience in some resolved artistic style or technique. Although, of course, he does famously, but along with any number of other artists, depict the new public spaces, forms of entertainment, and Haussmannian boulevards full of consumer spectacle. Rather, there is an indirect equivalence between the incoherence of Manet's paintings and the incomprehensibility of the experience of the time, or perhaps the ideology of the time. In a work like Bar at the Folies Bergère, it's not so much the fact of Manet's depiction of the new phenomenon of the café concert that is the true expression of modernity, but the scattering of the viewer's attention around the edges of the canvas, the impossibility of the spectator's point of view, where are we in the mirror, the unreadability of the barmaid's blank expression. It's not a direct representation that is at stake here, and Manet is not fundamentally a representational painter, but an implicit correspondence between a failure to represent and what cannot be represented. This complicating enormously, in fact, that base superstructure model that Clarke would otherwise want to put into place. Now, Quilty's work is similarly expressive, we would say, but not directly expressive in the way his commentators suggest. It is not at all the case, as he asserts, quote, I had such extreme feelings about the smell, sound and emotions of being in Afghanistan, and I wanted to convey these. It is also not, as the curator of the Australian War Memorial Exhibition, Laura Webster, writes in the catalogue, quote, these portraits tell us about the lived experience and memory of these servicemen and women, while giving voice to and recognising the emotional weight of war that they will carry with them throughout their lives. I ask you, do you see that in these pictures? We are tempted to say, uninterestingly, that Quilty would be incapable of doing this. But this is not at all to explain the work's public acclaim and recognition they have received, why both the critics and the general public have responded to them so positively. Rather, we would say both that Quilty is unwilling to and it's not necessary to do this. In fact, what he so brilliantly accomplishes is to produce for us the signs of this empathy without any real content, knowledge or experience of those to whom we would be empathetic. And we see this in his work and in Manet's, not in any mere failure or incompetence, but in the tracing of a kind of boundary or limitation, which we would describe precisely as the ideology of our contemporary world of solicitude at a distance or care without responsibility. The ideology of all those internet campaigns, Facebook signings and Twitter trendings in the name of a good cause. You have a culture of sort of empathetic participation. It's everything that might constitute our new fog of war that Quilty gives such profound expression to. Not the inability to know the capability and intentions of the other, but the unwillingness, conscious or unconscious, to do so. For any actual analysis of the pros and cons of war, a generalised empathy for the soldier and his or her experiences, but again without any real desire to know what they are or to deal with their consequences. And as the highest expression of this complicit vagueness between artist and spectator, take that otherwise inexplicable miasmatic cloud reaching out towards us, but also staying exactly where it is, surrounding Sergeant P, the work now purchased with the public support by the Queensland Art Gallery, with which my meditations on Quilty's work began. A shared complicity, after all, that reassures us that we do not really have to do anything about Sergeant P, do not really have to get to know him, as long as we buy the picture. Thank you.